Hi, I'm Rachel and welcome to my channel, Chapel Hill Maker. You can find me on Instagram and Ravelry also as Chapel Hill Maker. And here is a channel where I love to share my journey of knitting and making here in beautiful Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So first off, wanted to say thank you so much for all of your wonderful comments and for your subscribing and messaging, and I am just having the best time connecting with you guys and look forward to more of it. Today is going to be a little bit of a different type of episode. I decided that it would be sort of fun to record my knitting journey, as much for maybe for my kids and family as it is for you guys, because I think it's sort of interesting to see where people come from and how they happen upon this craft that I'm so still completely obsessed with after so many years. And I'll apologize in advance if you hear Mary Poppins chewing in the background. She gets her fresh bully stick when I'm recording so that she won't be barking, and you may hear Sawyer downstairs trying to protect our house from Amazon deliveries and squirrels. So hopefully they will cooperate, but again, just wanted to thank you so much for being here. And I sort of hesitated a little bit about filming this because I wasn't really sure how sort of deep to go on my story, because knitting has been the thing for me that has shown up over and over again in my life when I really needed it. So some of it's funny, some of it's hard to share, and some of it is just that life journey that I think maybe we all go on. So hopefully you'll find something you can relate to here, or that you can laugh at, or that, you know, if this isn't your jam, my next episode will be a typical podcast and you can catch back up with me then. So just to give you a heads up, this is what I'm wearing today. It's the No Frills sweater by Petite Knit. And this amazing green is the color Parade by Sonder Yarn Co. And it's in Halo and Sunday Morning 4-ply. And I finished this a few years ago, and I had been searching just for the perfect green, and Melissa did not disappoint. And so I strongly recommend her yarn. Everything I've made in it I have loved, and her colors are fantastic, and her communication is great, and I just wish she lived in North Carolina because I want to be her friend. So yeah, so this is the No Frills by Petite Knit. It was a great basic to have, and I keep intending to make more, but I just haven't gotten around to it. So yeah, so now I'm going to get to my my Knitstory, my knitting history, my knit story. I've been playing around with some version of that and haven't gotten to one that I love, but it's been funny this week as I've been kind of planning this episode and collecting items that you'll see as I go through to plan going back in time. I've been looking at so many baby pictures of my kids, and I keep hearing that remember on Sesame Street when Cookie Monster did the playoff on Masterpiece Theater? I kind of keep picturing Cookie Monster in the back of my head with opening the big leather book, and I don't know that my story is quite that grand, but again, hopefully some of it will resonate with you, and if not, I will look forward to catching up with you again soon. But my knitting story starts with this lady right here, and you may have noticed her in the background of the last episode. Hopefully that's not glaring too much, but this is my grandmother Marcia, and this is her way before I was born, possibly before my dad was born, but she was a huge influence to me in so many ways in my life. She was a real caregiver, and she taught me how to cook and bake, and she was a sewist and just a sort of a very classic, you know, early 1900s homemaker, and caregiver for my dad and then for my brother and I. And so our parents divorced when I was young, and we spent a lot of time with her as we were going through that process, and she really was a safe space for us. And even though that picture shows her smiling and knitting, and it looks like she's kind of in the middle of a really fun time, she was kind of a serious lady. And so when my dad found this picture, and it was like this, literally like this big when he found it in the bottom of a drawer, it kind of took my breath away to see her with a smile on her face, with her knitting in her hands, because obviously it just felt so familiar to me as a maker. And so my sweet grandmother, I begged her and begged her and begged her to teach me how to knit. And finally, I think I was about 9 years old, and she decided she was ready to take on the challenge. And I was born with an affliction of left-handedness, and so she was right-handed, and teaching me to knit was a bit of a stressor for her. And so I have a very vivid memory, and I don't have a ton of like really clear childhood memories. And this one, I remember she sat me down opposite her, because if I was lefty, I was obviously going to have to go in the other direction as far as she was concerned. And so I sat down, and I can remember she sighed because she was thinking so hard about how she was going to make this happen for me, because I wanted to knit so badly, and I was really a little girl. And so I couldn't even tell you how long it took us, but we sat for a long time. And not only did she teach me how to knit, but she taught me how to mirror knit, which I don't do anymore, but I look back at that and I just think that was, pretty brave of her to try to figure it out to accommodate my knitting disability by her standards. And so I did. And not only did I have a vivid memory of walking around her house with these needles. And you can see these are just old timey straight needles. They even have my initials on them from when I was little, size US 10.5 needles. And I can remember walking around. We sewed a knitting bag out of Holly Hobby fabric. For those of you who were born of my Gen X generation, you may remember Holly Hobby before she had a makeover and became sort of cool. But back then she was not cool. She was just very colonial. And so I remember my Holly Hobby bag that I sewed by hand, and it held a ball of yarn in it, and I can remember sticking my needles in there, and I was so proud. And it was at a time where I really was, I needed something to feel proud of. I was sort of the first kid on my block to have a single mom, and it was just great to have this accomplishment under my belt, and gave me a feeling of confidence as I kind of went through my day. And as with any hobby that you take on when you're a little girl, most of us sort of move on to other things. I did gymnastics and all the other sort of kid things you do as you're growing up. And so I put knitting aside for a long time. And then after I graduated from college, I got a job and I worked for the United Way of New York City. And for those of you who don't know, the United Way is a fundraising organization that helps smaller charities that can't afford to have a development department. They sort of act as their development department. And so I did that. And one of our clients was Vogue. And so they are the producers of Vogue Knitting Magazine, Butterick Patterns, and just really a scion of our industry. I, at 22 years old, had no clue that they were sort of these, knitting famous people. And boy, I wish I had taken better notes about who I was sitting at a table with. But they had a a weekly or bi-weekly knitting circle that was open during lunch. And so when I went over one day to do a fundraising meeting with them, I said, oh, my grandmother taught me how to knit. I would love to pick it back up again. And so they said, well, why don't you come to our knitting circle? You're welcome to join us. And so it was just employees. It was like, I don't know, I want to say it was like 6 or 7, for those of you with middle schoolers, 6 or 7 of us in a room. And I show up, no needles, no yarn, no anything, just sort of eager to knit. And they handed me some needles and they handed me some yarn. And I picked them up and I just start knitting. And I had remembered how to knit the way my grandmother taught me, which was essentially backwards. And I can sort of, in my memory, and this is probably not true, but in my memory, it was like that record scratch moment where everybody was just looking at me like, what are you doing? And so they asked me and I said, well, this is how my grandmother taught me. She said, this is how a left-handed person is supposed to knit. And so the sweet people over at Vogue Knitting handed me the Vogue Knitting Bible. And if you have any connections to anyone who was on the editorial staff at Vogue Knitting in the late 1990s, I would love to connect with them again because they were just so nice to me. And they gave me some really beautiful wool yarn and some new needles. And they said, okay, why don't you go home, take this book, and why don't you go home and relearn how to knit in, the more typical direction. And so, moving your stitches from left to right on the needle. And they said, you can continue to mirror knit, but you'll have to rewrite patterns or, sort of do a little more upfront math. And I don't like math. So I was really happy to take this book, and what a huge gift, because at the time I was a 22-year-old kid and it was a nice and expensive book to have. And they gifted this to me and I came back and I learned to knit my very first pattern, which I had up until about a year ago. And if I find it again, I'll show it on the podcast, but it was a beret. Like imagine, like Mary Tyler Moore style beret. And I'm not quite that old, but this was 1998, I think. And so the beret was adorable. However, it could have been used as like a Kevlar style vest. My knitting gauge was so tight, and this adorable beret took a lot of work to get on my head, but mind you, I wore it in a New York City winter because I made it and I was really proud. But that beret is actually my only sort of evidence of having knitted back at that time period in my life. And hopefully I can track it down, but I know it's somewhere in my house. And so, yeah, so those ladies at Vogue Knitting were just so lovely and generous with their time and their energy. And it kind of sparked my knitting interest again. But as happens in your 20s, I was distracted with getting my career off the ground, getting engaged to my wonderful husband, planning a wedding, moving down here to North Carolina, and eventually having my kids. And so knitting again fell by the wayside for me. And it wasn't until I had my second daughter, I left my job and decided to become a stay-at-home mom. My husband was in training still, and I had a lot of time on my own with my 2 then babies, who are now young women who are 21 and 23. And I had an infant and a toddler. And so it was, as any of you who have kids or have seen kids know, it's a hectic time. They're 27 months apart, and I was largely doing a lot of the heavy lifting with them on my own. As I said, my husband was in training and his job required really long days. And so I found that I had a really pretty serious case of the baby blues, and it took a while for me to even understand what was going on. But at the time, medication wasn't really available to me for that, and I was nervous because I was nursing, and decided to just try other avenues to get through that challenging stage. And so I know now there's better options, and admire any woman who has to struggle through it. And the path I took ended up being an okay one for me. I don't know if there would have been a better one, but this was sort of my solution, if you will. At the time, I think this was a less talked about and less understood situation. And so again, I'm a Gen Xer who is more of a white knuckle power through kind of girl. And so when I realized that that wasn't serving me, I had to sort of figure out what to do. And so with the help of some really lovely professionals that I talked to, and ultimately knitting, I found that I was able to sort of climb my way out. And I don't even, honestly, I can't tell you how I ended up in a yarn store. For those of you who lived around Durham in the early 2000s, you will remember next to Elmo's Diner was a really unique shop. It's a children's store now, but in the front of the store, it was a shoe store, and they had cute and comfortable and expensive shoes that I couldn't afford. And so I think I must have just been taking the babies on a walk and happened in there, but in the back of this shoe store was a yarn store named Cozy. And so I don't know, and like in my really spotty memory, it was sort of one of those like movie moments where it was just cut to me in a yarn store. No idea how I got there, no idea how I got home, but I just was in there with my two kids, probably my toddler pulling things off the wall. And I imagine it's probably way more chaotic in real life than it was in my memory. But I went in, I bought some yarn, I bought some needles, and I went home. And when I got the kids to bed that night, I sat down. Now this is before YouTube, and the internet was still sort of not nearly as useful as it is now. iPhones did not exist yet. And I found a website called knittinghelp.com, and the videos I can remember came up on my computer were like these teeny little videos, and I had to sit there with my eyes really close trying to figure out how to do the stitches and what I was doing, because I had just, even though it had only been, 6 years or so since I had picked up needles, I had to relearn again. And so for me, knitting has always been a journey of learning and relearning and relearning. And so I think even today, but with the help of knittinghelp.com and some patience, I knit my very first project. And you'll notice I did not even weave in my ends. And I know there's pictures somewhere of my daughter wearing this hat, but I knit this hat, and if you look, no, it is not ribbed, but I was wrapping my yarn in the wrong direction for every single stitch, and it created this really, actually sort of pretty texture. And I can remember triumphantly walking back into the yarn store and the hat on my daughter's head and showing her what I had accomplished. And for me, emotionally, it was so gratifying. It was the first like win I felt like I had after giving birth to my daughter. And the lady lovingly looked at it and said, "Oh, you did a nice job, but you twisted your stitches. Do you want me to pull them out for you?" At which point I'm sure I looked at her pretty horrified, but I said, "No, thank you." And I left the store, but I have no idea where this pattern came from. I don't know what the yarn was. I think it's cotton. At the time, we were not in a financial position to buy beautiful yarn and beautiful needles and all of the things that now I do get to enjoy. So I'm certain I bought yarn that I could afford and found that I could not knit fast enough to work through everything I was working through. And so I became a really voracious knitter. And I don't have a lot of the things I worked on, but I'm gonna share some of them with you because again, I think it's fun to see where people came from, but it's a lot of pink and purple. And those in my knitting group will giggle because I always joke that I inadvertently do everything in Neapolitan ice cream colors. And so I think you will see that sort of theme coming up, although I feel like I finally beat that. But I was knitting, I think, a poncho for my daughter in purple yarn with fun fur lining. If you remember what fun fur was, it was like an eyelash yarn that was really popular. And my girls loved to play dress up, and they loved wearing this poncho around the house. And I was sitting at the mall, and they had a big playground where you could go and the kids could wander around. It was a safe space. It was enclosed, and they could go and it had bouncy things and foam stuff, and they loved it. And so it was a great way for me to get out of the house with the kids, and I would sit on the bench on the side and knit. And one day I look over and there's a woman knitting next to me, and she was like, she knit so fast, and so like what she was making was so beautiful, and I just fell over myself to try to talk to her about her knitting. And so her name is Christine Schwender, and I credit with kind of giving me all of the real basics of knitting. And it turns out that she and her friend, who had sadly just passed away, created this book called Barefoot Knits. And the concept of this, which I still love, was that the whole book was knit at one gauge, and it was all kid stuff. And at the time, we didn't really knit in the round, it was all knit circular. But look at these, and these are their children in these patterns who are now adults and doctors, and so it's even funny to look back at this now. But she basically taught me how to do everything. But so the point of this book was one pair of needles, one yarn. They did the whole book in brown sheep cotton fleece, and endless possibilities was their slogan here. And so Christine essentially like gave me yarn, gave me beautiful needles. They were these lantern moon wooden needles, and taught me how to do so many different knitting techniques that I don't think I would even know today if I hadn't happened upon her. And so you may be noticing a trend here where I have benefited so much from the generosity of women throughout my life as I learned how to knit, and one man who is my husband, who has always been an amazing supporter of my crafts, no matter what they are. And so Christine and I, her husband was also in a fellowship training, and so we both had a lot of time where it was just us and our kids. And so we started a play group where we would knit, the kids would play, and it was great. And so back up a little bit, these were some of my early projects that I made, and I think this is a Susan Anderson pattern. I knit my way through her hat book, which I still have, and that's this, Itty Bitty Hats, which had some of just the cutest baby, and I'm pretty sure I did not know about blocking as I'm looking at all of these, but look at these little ear flaps. And a lot of these are in that brown sheep cotton fleece that Christine generously shared with me. This was another one out of that book where I learned how to cable and lace. And that was a scrap project. And so here, I think this may have been my first project with her from this book. And I'll put up pictures as I come to them of ones of my kids in them, because how cute. These were so much fun to make, and I learned an inordinate amount. And again, these are seamed, and they have elastic and an I-cord waist. So I learned mattress stitch and the best thing about that yarn was that I could throw it in the wash because I was a busy mom of 2 little active girls. And I think at least 3 out of my 4 children wore these pants, and they've held up pretty well. They could use a gleaning. And so, yeah, so Christine was just the most creative maker I had ever met. She would just bang, and she knit so fast. She would knit a sweater in 3 or 4 days. And she was approached by In Knitters magazine. I don't think they publish anymore. And so we took on the challenge of helping her get ready for this photo shoot for In Knitters magazine, where she designed this skirt. And I knit 2 of them, one for each of my daughters. And it was called the twirly skirt, I think. And this one might be on Ravelry. I'll link it if it is. And this was intended to be both a poncho and a skirt. And so a lot of her designs were designed so that you could grow into things. And so if you're able to get your hands on that Barefoot Knits book, a lot of them I think could be converted into in the round knitting, but it is out of print. And funny enough, Christine doesn't design anymore. She isn't still an incredibly creative woman, but hasn't been designing knitwear in quite some time. But here is that In Knitters, just to share the, this right here is my daughter, and that's another woman from our knitting group. That's her daughter. And so they are both now women in their 20s. And this was the original top. And this I think is so clever, and I've been seeing this lately actually, was a plain t-shirt with an I-cord applique on it. And so yeah, so that was sort of the pinnacle for me, that my kid and my knitting was in a knitting magazine, and how cool was that? So at that time I sort of got more creative, and I just made patterns up. This was a little purse I made for my daughter. You can see it was very well loved. I think I got an I-cord machine then, and so I was really into the I-cord, but I did this Intarsia initial on there. And this is one just makes me laugh because my daughter, at the time my youngest, now we have 4, and she was my number 2, but wore this hat to death on the playground, loved this thing. And I look at it now and I just think people must have thought she looked like a spike protein or something. But I look back now and I kind of marvel at what an adventurous maker I was. I really just, and maybe some of it was because there was no social media, so there was no comparison, and I just sort of went for things. And so this was I couldn't tell you the yarn, couldn't tell you the pattern. Again, a seamed raglan zipper sweater, very Neapolitan ice cream. The sun is kind of coming through here. That I definitely wore. Now I'm a little bit curious to try it on again. This was a freeform pattern that I just made up. I don't know that it ever fit me. As one of my early, I crocheted a border on it, which I don't crochet, so I guess I learned for that. This is another self-drafted pattern that I had made then, and it's a cable knit little clutch, and I had my husband make little dowels to look like knitting needles as the handles. And so and I even lined it with a silk scarf that I had in my, that I own. And so I look back at some of this now, and I marvel a little bit at everything that I was churning out, especially because I was spending a lot of time with 2 little ones. And I even made socks, which I, again, no recollection of. And this was with some cashmere yarn that I know Christine had gifted me. And they have cables. The gauge is way too big. The socks are way too big, but they are good bed socks, and I still wear them to this day. And then at that point, I think Knitty magazine came out, and that was one of the first online resources, because I don't think Ravelry was born until about 2012. And I made the viral Clapotis. It's supposed to be a shawl. I made mine into a scarf because I ran out of yarn. I remember that very clearly, but look at how cool with the drop stitches. I actually went on to make another one of these too later because I loved it so much. During this time when my kids were little and, you know, we were sort of powering through that time period of having toddlers and sort of still building our life very much, is when I met Maddie from Colorado Knitter, and our husbands were in training together, and she and I both would sort of catch up when we could. We both had little busy ones, and those were kind of our first knit-alongs. I have a lace tank top that I made that we knit together. She knit a black one, I knit a white one. I don't know that either of us finished them at the time because I think we had bit off more than we could chew, but that was kind of our first time knitting along together. And I found it when we moved into the house that I'm in now and finished it. And now my 21-year-old wears it, which is kind of fitting because she was the reason I kind of came back to knitting. And she is super knit worthy. She loves wearing hand knit items that I've made. And so I love getting pictures of her at school wearing different knitted items that I've made for her. So I would say that kind of period of really busy knitting took a back seat after my third daughter was born. I knit a little bit with her, and then when number 4 came along, there was no knitting time. It was like drinking out of a fire hose. So that again kind of took a back seat. I think my youngest just turned 16, and so Ravelry came out a little bit after she was born, and I signed up. I was like a beta tester for Ravelry, and it kind of blew my mind with what was in there, but just wasn't in a place to be knitting regularly. And about 9 years ago, because Sawyer just turned 9 this week, about 9 years ago, I had some foot surgery and decided I needed something to keep my hands busy while I was going to be at home. And I pulled my knitting out again, and it's amazing how every single time I just keep coming back to knitting, how it finds me when I need it. And I would say pretty consistently since then, I have been just making and obsessed with making. And we hosted a party, a reunion here in 2018, I think, 2017, and Maddie and her family came east and attended the reunion, and she and I caught up about knitting. And I asked, we sort of were instantly like no time had passed. It was like, what are you making? What are you doing? Are you still knitting? Are you still doing that? And since then, she and I text almost daily about knitting and making, and invariably what else is going on in our lives. And she was the reason that I found out that there was a whole virtual world of knitting, including introducing me to the Grocery Girls on YouTube. And I found School of Sweet Georgia at that point. And I mean, I just was obsessed with everything she was making. And Instagram, I didn't even have an account at that point, I don't think. And then found all of the excitement on Knitstagram, and I did we did a ton of knitting together. I think we were kind of at this point where both of our kids were out at school, and we had a little bit more free time in our day before we had to go driving for after school activities. And so we did a lot of knitting over text together. And so our first knit along was my first real color work project. And if you want, you could put on sunglasses because the colors of this are kind of wild, which are very funny for me. But I look back at this super fondly because we knit this, I think, in about a week, and you will recognize this as the Soldotna Crop by Caitlin Hunter, Boylan Knitworks. And I am still so proud of this. Like, I look at it all these years later and I say, wow, look, that's like pretty decent color work. If I did this again, I would probably fix my underarm pickup. Was not great, but it was my, first time doing color work. I feel pretty good about this. Not necessarily my colors, but I think it was kind of brave and kind of fun to make. And so Madi and I had a great time with that. And I am eternally grateful for her to sort of introduce me to this bigger world of knitting. And through Instagram, I met my regular knitting group that we now have been meeting regularly for 2.5 or 3 years, I think. And well, maybe more actually, because we met right after COVID, then when things started opening up after COVID. And we found each other because I noticed that people had Chapel Hill in their bio, or they posted somewhere in Chapel Hill that I recognized, and I reached out to them and said, hey, would you ever want to knit together? And just by that simple direct message, I've gained some new friends that I can't imagine my life without. And so if you notice the theme here of connection and kindness that I have benefited from this community, it just doesn't end. And so we've been knitting together for several years, and it still takes me back to my grandmother, who again was just so kind and generous to sit with me. I know it wasn't what she wanted to be doing at that moment, but she saw a little girl who needed that, and I thank her every day for the gift that she gave me. And just to point out, I knit the mat for this, and eagle eye among you will notice that the place when they framed it put it on sideways and backwards, but it kind of doesn't bother me. I still love it. I look at this every single day while I'm knitting, and it really takes me back to how grateful I am for this making experience and what it has done to enrich my life. And that really brings me up to Chapel Hill Maker with y'all, and because I've already just gained so much connection from this, even just in 4 episodes of filming, and it's given me a confidence to talk to people that I wouldn't maybe talk to. And so again, full circle, a thank you for watching. And next time I'll catch you up on all of my projects and what I've been doing. But thank you so much for listening to my Knitstory, for my story time with Chapel Hill Maker. And I would love to know more about your knitting journey. If you want to comment below on it or send me a direct message. Does any of this resonate with you? I can't tell you how many times knitting has saved me over the years, and it has been with me during my happiest and my lowest moments. And so I almost feel bad for non-knitters for not having that opportunity to have with them at all times. And so I'm sort of smug about this hobby that I've taken on that's become such a huge part of my life, and just eternally grateful. And so thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.